Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and Realistic Booktober continues with an all-time fan favorite, Gyarados. So last week I made a skeletonless Arbok and it turned out pretty darn okay. However, as we get closer to Halloween, I feel like I need to hit that spooky skeleton quota, so this week I'm going to make sure to give Gary an all-aluminium skeleton. Functionally, it's not necessary, but I've eaten a lot of takeout recently, so I have a surplus of foil lying around begging to be used. I've wrapped the foil in a layer of clay, then I can start to lay out the segmented sections. Now, Gyarados' original design goes for a very multi-spherical style, and while I'm going to make this a lot more scaly looking, I still want to keep those obvious body sections. Once I've cut my sections out, I'll soften the edges, then pinch the center in to make it a bit more streamlined. Finally, I'll come back through with a variety of tools to scuff up and mark up the surface to really make Gary look like he's been through some stuff. Even though there's nothing in the ocean, it always seems like sea creatures are covered in scuff marks and battle wounds. I'm not really sure what they're bumping into down there, but at least it makes for a bit more of an interesting texture. I'm also working in sections so that I can more easily handle this long boy, so I've baked the body once to lock the clay in place before I add the upper crust to the body. I'll lay a thin layer down over top, then cut it to width before blending it in. Now I want to make his top half a bit sharper, so I'm going to add a few extra long, extra chunky wormy dealies along his center line and the sides before blending them in to create a uniform surface. Then using the segmented lines on his belly as a guide, I can start to bring that line up across the back to connect around the other side. Then, same as I did with the belly, I can soften up the sharper edges to create more obvious segmentations. Then I can add all the little scuff marks and surface details. Once I'm happy with the detail, it's into the oven again to lock it all in place, and I can get started on his head. I'll smoosh an oblong egg onto the tip of the body, cut a mouth line down the middle, then get to work adding some facial details. Same as with the rest of the body, I want to keep the general aesthetic of Gary in place while trending a bit more towards something with a bit less of an underbite. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not throwing shade at Gary's underbite. I love his underbite. I think it's endearing as heck. It's just not quite in fitting with the idea I have in my mind. Of course, one of his most important features is his little spiky tribrow, so I've made sure to add that. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can poke some eye holes for his eyeballs, drop them in place, toughen up his orbital ridge, then add some of his extra side spikes. Now looking back, I probably should have saved his tribrow for last, since it's a pain to have to work around and it literally just sits on top of everything. But I was anxious to see how much it would make him look like a proper Gyarados at this point, so I threw it on extra early. Once I poked a couple smelling holes, I can get to work building up the inside of his mouth. I'm fresh off of making a snake, and Gyarados is kinda like a snake, so I'm just gonna go ahead with the snake-style internal mouth parts. I tried a few different ways of incorporating his hilariously oversized lips, but I couldn't figure out a way to make him not look goofy, so I just ended up painting them on afterwards as markings. For now though, I'll poke a whole bunch of holes into his gums so I can give him a beautiful set of perfectly lined up teeth. For the colored scales that run along the length of his body, I thought maybe I could make colored scales that run along the length of his body. I am, however, gonna make these ones sit on top of his body rather than just look like a slight discoloration. Then of course they get all nicked and banged up as well. To make the fins that attach behind his head, I'll take a thin sheet of clay, cut a circle out of it, then have that circle. Then using the old pinchy rolly technique, I'll form those semicircles into passable head fins. I'll make his tongue by rolling a ball into a tongue-shaped blob, then cut a line down the middle and add some rolly textures and some grooves, then I'll jam it into the back of Gary's gob. To make the fin on the tip of the tail, I've squished out a flat of sheet clay, which I can then use as the bottom of my clay and armature wire sandwich, out of which I can cut the various tail-like shaped shapes into. I'll build up the center of the tail, then peel it off my baking tray and do the old ball stylus rolly technique to give it a nice wavy texture. Then I'll snip the tip of the tail off so that I can stick my fin in place, bend it into an adequately action-y pose, then fill in the exposed wire bone with some more clay before continuing the segmented pattern up to the tip of the fin. Gary's got some spiky, spiny things sticking out of his back that I think might be fins, but I don't want to make fins anymore, so instead I'm going to give him a set of spiky spiny things. I figured if spiky spiny things are good enough for Godzilla, then they're damn well good enough for Garyzilla. Otherwise, the only thing left to do is give him his little dangly double beard hairs that hang down the side of his face, which I made by bending a little wire into the appropriate shape and jamming into his jaw. Otherwise, he's finished and ready for some paint. I'll give him a quick once over with a bone white primer to help the subsequent layers adhere a little bit better to the clay. Then I can paint his underside with a very nearly white off-white. I'm going to try and stick to the original color scheme, so I'll give his fins a white coat. The side scales will get the same color as his underside, and then the spiky spiny things will be white as well. However, I decided if I'm going to make a realistic Gyarados, then why not make the shiny version? To that end, instead of blue, he's going to get a deep blood red base coat on his top half. Now to roughen up the underside and bring it a little closer to the original artwork and to help add some shading, I'm going to give the underside a dirty brown wash. However, I decided that the white spiky spiny things on the fins looked a little bit too out of place, so I ended up using the same wash on them, but then I sponged off any of the excess, so I was left with a nice brown to white gradient. I'll paint his mouth and tongue with varying pinks, reds, and purples till it looks kinda like a mouth. Then I'll paint the teeth with a white base coat, followed by the same brown wash that gets wiped off to leave a lovely, gnarly discoloration. Finally, I'll give his eyes a black base coat followed by a white top coat, and then it's time to make him some lunch. I thought it'd be a bit boring to have Gary just swimming through the water all by his lonesome, so I decided that maybe he ought to be out hunting something. And then I settled on the tastiest looking water Pokemon, Spheal. Actually, I was running out of time to finish this, so I was trying to think of which Pokemon would be the easiest to make, and I figured Spheal is basically just a sphere with a face and a tail, which is why I ended up on him. Besides, a realistic Spheal is just a morbidly obese seal, so making a tiny version of that was both thematically and technically appropriate. Otherwise, with my Spheal sculpted, painted, and looking chonky AF, I realized I would be doing myself and everyone else a great disservice if I didn't also take the time to make a teeny tiny school of Magikarp as well. And by school, I mean about 6 of them, since it's more like one of those really rural schools that caters to a very small community of local farmers and has a graduating class of about 4 kids each year. To make the handling of these tiny fish possible, I'll start by sculpting their heads first by chopping some tiny balls in half and then sticking them to the flat of my fancy cheese knife. Then I can start adding the itty bitty important Magikarp details, like a great big mouth, relatively big eyeballs, and a big floppy tongue. Then I'll cure the clay with a heat gun so that I can pop them off my knife and I can get to work adding their back ends. The little oblong eggs stuck to the flat of their heads will be the body, and then I'll texture that using this diamond pattern on my scalpel. Then I'll go about adding the teeny tiny pre-baked fins before priming them white and moving on to the painting. Now 2022 isn't quite finished yet, but I already know that my greatest regret of the year is having not made the little yellow Magikarp mustaches. I tried a couple different materials, but they were all too fat or flimsy, and I ended up giving up on them. In hindsight, I probably could have made them out of teeny tiny wormy dealies, but hindsight is 2020, and 2020 was a terrible year for everyone, so I just want to move on. And to help me move on, I'm gonna take a hot minute to peel some plastic wrap off of some acrylic sheets. The Perspex sheet will of course be my frame for the troubling amount of resin I plan to pour, but this time I'm gonna try something a bit different. Normally I seal all my molds with hot glue and it inevitably leaks and makes me very sad. This time, however, my idea is to use silicone caulking, which is a waterproof sealant and adhesive used in bathrooms, as a waterproof sealant and adhesive for my resin mold. Also, to help suspend everyone in the resin, I picked up some of this clear fishing line in the hopes that it will be less visible than the acrylic rods. I'll drape it over the sides of the mold, then clamp the ends in place and lay Gary down on top of the line. A little UV resin will hold it to the top of Spheal so that I can dangle him down in front. Then I could attach all the Magikarps around Gary, either using his body as an anchor or hanging them from some stir sticks draped across the mold. Once they're all in place, it's time to mix some resin. Due to poor planning, Gary ended up being a lot bigger than I had originally expected, which means I ended up having to pour almost 6 liters of resin. I don't have a big enough mixing container for that, so instead I'm going to mix up 3 equally sized cups and tint them using the same amount of ink. I'm not really sure if it's a good idea or not, but I like to live life on the edge. After all, like the kids say, you only YOLO once. And with my 3 pots looking clean and bubble free, I can start the ever stressful task of encasing a week's worth of work inside a month's rent worth of resin, then set it aside and hope for the best. 72 hours later though, I can breathe an audible sigh of relief. Now as for the fishing line, it worked perfectly, except for this strand here, which is completely visible for reasons that I do not understand. All the other ones are basically invisible, but this one is as clear as day. Whatever, I'll just Photoshop that out of the thumbnail and then hope that at this point you're too invested to turn back. Otherwise, I could start removing the clamps before getting to the best part of any resin-related pour, removing the mold. I'll then snip the tips of the fishing line flush with the water line, then I can use a sharp knife to remove the excess resin that's creeped up the sides of the mold. Finally, the absolute last thing to do is add some waves on top, which I'll make using the exact same silicone I used to seal my mold. This stuff is my go-to for most water effects since it dries crystal clear and it's easy to manipulate with a few squirts of alcohol on a fingertip. I'm not going to add any white caps to the waves though, since the waves on top are really only going to be used to add some light refraction to the resin underneath. Otherwise, once the silicone is cured, we're all finished here and on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to my lovely patrons and a very special shout out to my newest patrons, Vanilla Swimmer, Kaina, Theome, Mary Helen Burns, Macaronic Fun, Scott Moore, Riley Meek, The Cat Murgatroyd, Kylie Jasper, Technoblade Never Dies, David Vavro, Adrian Lutz, Matthew Radke, Phoenix Gladden, Love You Resin Philomena, Nick Marinello, Christopher Kiriazis, Edelon, Nick, and Nora and Eliza K. You were the gallons of blue syrup that this channel floats within. As always, if you like this video, then something liking, smashing, and subscribing to notifying and all that jazz. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.